June 68 CE. Outside Rome, a man is hiding, not in a palace, not behind the walls of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, in a small villa outside the city, owned by one of his former slaves, crouched in a ditch near the road, listening to the sound of horses getting closer. His name is Nero. He is 30 years old. He is the Emperor of Rome. 4 people are with him. 4 weeks ago, he commanded an empire of 60 million people, stretching from the beaches of Britain to the deserts of Syria. Tonight, 4 people are all that is left. The Senate has declared him a public enemy. The army has abandoned him. The men who swore oaths of loyalty to him are, at this very moment, riding toward him with orders to execute him in the oldest and most humiliating way Roman law allows. Stripped, beaten, his head locked in a wooden frame, dying in public. Like a criminal, he picks up a blade. He holds it to his throat. His hand shakes. He cannot do it. He looks at Epaphroditus, the slave standing beside him, and asks him to help. The horses are close now. He can hear them on the road, and in the last seconds of his life, Nero, Emperor of Rome, says something that people have been arguing about ever since. Qualis artifex pereo. What an artist dies in me. Not what an emperor, not what a ruler, not even what a man. An artist. That one word is the key to everything. Because the story of Nero is not simply the story that 2,000 years of history handed down to us. The crimes were real. The fires burned. The bodies were buried. But underneath all of that is a different story. One that actually explains how the most powerful man in the world ended up dying in a ditch, begging a slave to kill him. It is the story of a person who was handed the world and spent his whole life searching for something the world could not give him. This is that story. Before Nero could become anything, he had to be born into something, and what he was born into was a family that had already run 4 experiments on the same question. The question was simple: what does absolute power do to a human being? The answer, 4 times in a row, was instability. Fear, or blood. Start with Augustus. He built Rome into an empire, gave it stability, gave it laws, gave it a reason to believe it would last forever. He also spent the last decades of his life watching everyone he loved die before him, or destroying them himself when they threatened what he had built. He died in 14 CE, having outlived his friends, his enemies, and most of his family. The machine he created was extraordinary. The human cost of building it was something he took to his grave. Then came Tiberius, capable, serious, effective. He also ended up hiding on the island of Capri while Rome was run by a man named Sejanus, who executed anyone he considered a threat. When Tiberius finally had Sejanus killed, he did it by sending a letter to the Senate that changed direction 3 times before revealing the point. Because even in executing his most powerful official, he was afraid of what might happen if the intention became clear too early. He died in 37 CE in circumstances that Tacitus described carefully enough to make the reader suspect murder without ever saying it. Then came Caligula. Rome celebrated when he took power. Within 3 years, the celebrations were over. He was assassinated in 41 CE by members of his own Praetorian Guard, stabbed 30 times in a palace corridor, which tells you something about how many people needed him to be dead before anyone felt safe. Then came Claudius, the family member nobody expected to matter. He governed with more competence than his 3 predecessors combined. expanded the empire, reformed the bureaucracy, and brought a kind of functional stability that Rome had not seen in years. He died in 54 CE after eating mushrooms at a dinner hosted by his wife. His wife was Agrippina, and Agrippina brings us to Nero. What you need to understand about the Julio-Claudian dynasty is not any individual member of it. What you need to understand is the system. Augustus had taken the bones of the Roman Republic and built an empire on top of them, while pretending the Republic still existed. He called himself the first citizen, not the king, because Romans had a deep and genuine hatred of kings that went back 500 years. But everyone knew what he actually was, and because the system had no legitimate way to transfer power, every succession became a crisis. Every transition from one emperor to the next was a moment when anyone with ambition and access to soldiers could ask the question, why not me? The answer to that question, in this family, was usually blood. Nero was born in 37 CE, the same year Caligula took power, in a family where survival was a skill and trust was a liability. His father died when Nero was 3. His mother was Agrippina the younger, and she was something else entirely. The boy born as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus came into a world where 4 emperors had already demonstrated what the machine did to the people inside it. He would spend the next 16 years being prepared to become the 5th experiment. Nobody asked him if he wanted to be. There is a coin minted in 54 CE, in the first months of Nero's reign, that tells you everything you need to know about his mother in a single image. On one side, Nero, the new emperor, facing right in the traditional profile of Roman power. On the other side, facing him, equal in size, equal in visual weight, Agrippina. The inscription gives her the same prominence as her son. The message is not subtle. She is not behind him. She is beside him. She is not a background figure. She is a co-ruler. No Roman empress had ever appeared on a coin like that before. Agrippina the younger was the daughter of Germanicus, the most beloved general of his generation, and the granddaughter of Augustus himself. She grew up understanding that she was close to the center of Roman power in a way that very few people in history ever are. She also grew up understanding, with the particular clarity that comes from watching rather than participating, exactly how that power worked and exactly what it cost the people who held it. She watched her father die young, possibly poisoned. She watched her mother blame Tiberius and say so loudly enough that Tiberius had her exiled and imprisoned, where she starved herself to death. She watched the family she had been born into get destroyed piece by a system that treated everyone, including its own, as expendable, and she learned. She learned the way people learn when the alternative to learning is death. She learned who had power and why they had it. She learned that in Rome, in this family, in this world, a woman had exactly 2 sources of power available to her: who she married and who she gave birth to. She used both with the precision of someone who had been studying the game her whole life. Her first marriage was arranged. Her second, to a wealthy man named Passienus Crispus. She managed more actively. He died and left her his fortune. Her third marriage was to her uncle, the Emperor Claudius, which required the Roman Senate to change the law against incestuous marriages, which they did, because Claudius wanted them to, and because that is what senates do for emperors. This is the woman who raised Nero. She had 1 child from her first marriage. one son, and from the moment it became clear that this son had a path to the throne. If she was careful, if she was patient, if she made exactly the right moves at exactly the right times, Agrippina poured everything into making that path as short and as smooth as possible. She brought Seneca back from exile in Corsica because she wanted the best possible tutor for her son. She secured the loyalty of Burrus, a trusted officer, and had him appointed as prefect of the Praetorian Guard, because whoever commanded the soldiers who protected the emperor effectively controlled who could become emperor. She arranged a betrothal between Nero and Octavia, Claudius's daughter, because that made Nero family in a way that strengthened his claim. Every move had a purpose. Every relationship served a function. Every favor was an investment. And in 54 CE, when Claudius died after that dinner, when the mushrooms did what mushrooms apparently did in this family, Nero was ready, 16 years old, trained, positioned, betrothed to the right woman, supported by the right soldiers, guided by the right teachers. He walked out to the Praetorian Guard and was declared emperor, and the guard accepted him, because Agrippina had spent years making sure they would. She had built this, every piece of it. She had done it while navigating a world that would have destroyed most people, with tools that the system barely permitted her to use. Through patience and intelligence, and a willingness to do what needed to be done without flinching. Here is the question that has no clean answer: was this love? She clearly believed it was. She clearly believed that what she was doing was giving her son the greatest possible life, the highest possible position, the most powerful foundation any mother could build for a child. She had sacrificed her own safety, her own freedom, her own desires, to get him here. But there is another way to look at it. The boy she was doing all of this for had never been asked what he wanted. His education was chosen for him. His wife was chosen for him. His future was chosen for him. He was prepared, from the moment he could walk, not for the life he might want to live, but for the role that was most useful to her plan. The tragedy is not that Agrippina was cruel. The tragedy is that she was, in her own way, doing exactly what she believed a mother should do, and the boy standing in front of those soldiers had no idea yet what it was going to cost him to wear the costume she had spent 16 years making. There is a detail about Nero's childhood that almost every account of his life mentions briefly and then moves past, because it does not fit neatly into the story of the monster or the story of the victim. The detail is this: he was genuinely talented. Not talented in the way that powerful people are often described as talented by writers who need them to be impressive. Talented in the way that teachers notice, in the way that comes through even in hostile sources written by people who had every reason to minimize it. He had a real ear for music. He wrote poetry that people actually read. He could draw. He was a quick student of rhetoric and philosophy, absorbing material that many of his contemporaries struggled with. None of this was supposed to matter. The education Agrippina designed for him was not built around what he was good at or what he enjoyed. It was built around what an emperor needed to be able to do: rhetoric, because an emperor must speak persuasively; philosophy, because an emperor must appear wise; military history, because an emperor must understand war. The arts were, at best, a finishing touch. At worst, they were a distraction from the serious business of preparation. Seneca, the man brought in to oversee all of this, was one of the greatest minds of the ancient world. His essays on Stoic philosophy, on the shortness of life, on the nature of friendship and the management of grief, are still read today because they are genuinely extraordinary pieces of thinking. He was also a man who understood, from the moment he walked into that assignment, that his job was not simply to educate a boy. His job was to shape a future emperor in a direction that would be useful to the empire, to Agrippina, and ideally to Seneca himself. What nobody in that arrangement was primarily concerned with was what Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the actual child underneath all the preparation, wanted. He wanted to make music. This sounds small in the context of everything else happening around him. A boy's preference for music over military history sounds like a minor detail, but follow it forward and it becomes the thread that runs through everything. Because in a life where every significant choice was made by someone else, music was the one space that felt genuinely his. When he played the lyre or sang, nobody had arranged it for a political purpose. Nobody was watching to evaluate whether it served the succession. It was just him and the sound. And for a boy growing up inside a machine that had been built entirely around his usefulness to other people's plans, that feeling of something being genuinely his own was everything. His name was changed when he was adopted into the imperial family. He went from Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, which was his father's name, his own name, the name he had been given at birth, to Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Drusus, Germanicus, which was a title more than a name, a collection of political associations assembled to communicate legitimacy and continuity. Every part of that new name was chosen for what it meant to Roman power. None of it was chosen for him. His wife was chosen for him. Octavia was the daughter of Claudius, which made the marriage politically valuable and personally meaningless. By most accounts, Nero and Octavia had nothing in common and no real connection to each other. They were two pieces of a political arrangement dressed up as a marriage. His home was the palace, which was not a home in any ordinary sense, but a functioning center of imperial administration, where every room had a purpose and every conversation had an audience, and the concept of private life was largely theoretical. And over all of this, present in every room and every decision, was Agrippina, watching, directing, reminding him, not always in words, but always clearly, that everything he had and everything he was had been built by her and existed in relationship to her plans. There is a story that in the early days of Nero's reign, Agrippina attempted to sit beside him on the dais when he received foreign ambassadors to literally share his seat of power, in public, in front of the representatives of other nations. The sources differ on exactly what happened, but the underlying dynamic they are all describing is real. She had built this. She believed she should be part of running it. And the boy on the throne was, in her understanding, still, in some fundamental way, her project. What did it feel like to be that boy? The sources do not preserve his interior life in any reliable way. What we have are actions and consequences, not thoughts and feelings. But we can look at what he reached for, repeatedly, throughout his life, and work backward to understand what was missing. He reached for audiences. He reached for performance. He reached for the specific experience of standing in front of people and doing something and having them respond to the thing he did, not to his title or his bloodline or his mother's plans, but to the actual thing he actually did in that actual moment. He reached for it so consistently, so urgently, at such personal and political cost, that it is hard to explain as mere vanity. Vanity does not require that much risk. What he was reaching for, over and over, was something he had never really had. The experience of being seen. He was 16 when he became emperor. He was trained, positioned, supported, and prepared in ways that most rulers throughout history would have envied. He had Seneca teaching him philosophy, and Burrus commanding his guard and the most powerful empire in the world at his disposal. He also had no idea who he was outside of what other people had decided he should be. That gap between the preparation and the person, between the role and the human being inside it, is where the entire story lives. Everything that follows, the good years and the terrible ones, the music and the fire, the mother's death and the slave's blade, all of it grows from that gap. He was 16 years old. Nobody had ever asked him what he wanted. Here is something that almost never makes it into the popular story of Nero, something that gets buried under everything that came later, something that even the ancient sources who despised him could not entirely erase. He started well, the first years of Nero's reign, roughly 54 to 59 CE, are remembered in the historical record with a complicated kind of grudging acknowledgement. Even writers who would later describe him as the worst of emperors, who had every motivation to make his entire reign look like a catastrophe, preserved the memory that something was different at the beginning. The administration functioned. The excesses were limited. There was a quality of relative restraint to the way power was exercised that would later seem, in hindsight, like a different era entirely. The Roman Senate found itself being consulted, actually consulted, as though its opinions had weight. Nero's early speeches emphasized the restoration of proper relationships between the emperor and the institutions of Roman government. He would not, he suggested, concentrate everything in himself. He would govern with the Senate, not over it. People believed him, or at least, people wanted to believe him, which in political life often produces the same short-term results. The Stoic philosophers and writers who moved in educated Roman circles found in this young emperor something to be cautiously optimistic about. He was literate. He was interested in ideas. He had been educated by one of their own. Perhaps this was the moment they had been theorizing about. The philosopher king made real. Wisdom and power finally occupying the same person. Seneca provided the intellectual framework. Burrus provided the military anchor. Between the two of them, they created something that functioned as a governing system, a way of translating the emperor's theoretical authority into actual decisions that actually worked. The system held as long as Nero was willing to work within it. The problem was structural, and it was there from the beginning. Even if it took years to become visible, everything depended on Nero listening to them. And Nero, as the years passed and the role became more familiar, and the constraints of the preparation years began to feel less like guidance and more like walls, was becoming less interested in listening. Think about what his situation actually was. He had been told his entire life what to think, what to study, what to want, who to marry, how to behave. He had been prepared for a role without ever being consulted about whether he wanted the role. And now he had the power of the entire Roman world at his disposal, and the people around him were still telling him how to use it. The question that had been building since childhood, the question that had never been answered and had perhaps never even been fully asked, started pushing toward the surface. What do I actually want? The answer was not political. It was not military. It was not administrative. It was the same answer that had been true since he was a boy. Learning to play the lyre in a palace where nobody cared what he was learning, as long as it served the succession. He wanted to perform. He began appearing at private gatherings, singing and playing. He made his interest in chariot racing publicly known, which horrified the Senate in ways that his actual governing decisions did not. Because a senator could survive a bad tax policy, but the image of the emperor of Rome competing in a circus, like a common entertainer, was an offense against the entire symbolic order that Roman power depended on. Agrippina tried to rein him in. Seneca tried to channel the energy into less damaging forms. Burrus told Agrippina that there were worse things an emperor could do than race chariots in private. They were all managing the same problem from different directions. A person who had been given everything except permission to be himself, and who was now, slowly, beginning to take that permission, whether anyone gave it to him or not. The 5 good years were real. The governance was real. The restraint was real. But underneath all of it, something was also moving that the governance and the restraint could not contain indefinitely. The tragedy was not that Nero failed immediately. The tragedy was that, for a while, the role worked, and that made the moment he stepped out of it all the more difficult to come back from. In the winter of 65 CE, a man sat in a warm bath in Rome and opened the veins in his wrists. He had been ordered to do this by his former student. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and he was, by almost any measure, the most important philosopher of the Roman world. His essays on grief and friendship and the passage of time are still read today. His letters to his friend, Lucilius, written in the last years of his life, contain some of the most honest and searching self-examination that any ancient writer produced. He wrote about the importance of living simply, about the danger of wealth, about the way that external success could hollow a person out if it was pursued at the expense of internal truth. He was also, at the time of his death, one of the wealthiest men in Rome. People have been calling Seneca a hypocrite for 2,000 years. That reading is easy and not entirely wrong, but it misses what his life actually demonstrates, which is something far more interesting and far more human than simple hypocrisy. What Seneca's life demonstrates is what happens to a genuinely intelligent and genuinely principled person when they decide to work inside a system that does not share their principles. The choices that system forces on you, the compromises that accumulate, the way each individual accommodation seems reasonable in the moment and damning in the aggregate. He had not wanted to be Nero's tutor. He had been in exile in Corsica when Agrippina arranged his return, and he understood perfectly well that the arrangement was political. But he also saw something in the assignment that genuinely engaged his philosophical imagination. Here was the question that Plato had asked and never answered: could a philosopher actually shape a ruler? Could wisdom genuinely guide power? He believed the answer was yes. And, in the early years, the evidence seemed to support him. Nero governed with restraint. The Senate was treated with respect. The worst excesses of the previous reigns were avoided. When Seneca looked at those years, he could see the shape of his own teaching in the outcomes. The education had worked. Philosophy had made a difference. Then the dynamic between them began to shift. Here is the specific texture of what that shift looked like. In the rooms where decisions were actually made, Seneca would arrive at a meeting with a position, a recommendation, a direction shaped by decades of thinking about how power should be exercised. Nero would listen. In the early years, listening meant engaging, pushing back, asking questions, eventually arriving somewhere close to what Seneca had recommended. As the years passed, listening began to mean something different. It meant waiting with the particular patience of a person who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply allowing the conversation to run its course before doing it. Seneca could feel the difference. Every advisor who has ever worked for someone more powerful than themselves knows that specific feeling, the moment when you realize your counsel has become ceremony. But there was something else happening in those years. Something worth naming, because it changed the nature of the relationship in a way that pure political drift cannot explain. Nero was watching his teacher. He was not simply drifting away from Seneca's influence. He was observing him, watching the gap between what Seneca wrote and what Seneca did, watching a man argue for simplicity from a position of enormous wealth, watching a man write about integrity while remaining inside a system that had long since demanded compromises from him, watching a man whose stated beliefs and daily realities did not line up in the way that Seneca's essays insisted they should. Whether Nero drew explicit conclusions from this watching, the sources do not say, but a person who has spent their whole life being prepared by other people, being shaped and directed and managed, tends to develop a finely tuned sense for the distance between what people say and what they are. Nero had been surrounded by people whose stated intentions and actual motivations did not perfectly align since the day he was born. He knew what that looked like. He had grown up reading the gap between words and actions as a survival skill. Seneca, for all his brilliance, was giving him one more lesson in exactly that gap. Seneca faced a choice that is not unique to ancient Rome and not unique to philosophers. It is the choice that anyone faces when they have built their sense of purpose around their ability to influence a situation that is moving away from them. Do you stay, telling yourself that your presence still limits the damage, that things would be worse without you? Or do you go, preserving your integrity at the cost of whatever influence you still have? Seneca stayed. He stayed through the death of Britannicus, which happened at a dinner table and was explained with unconvincing accounts of epilepsy. He stayed through the increasing public performances, the chariot racing, the singing that made the senatorial class feel their world was being mocked. He stayed through the slow transformation of the promising young emperor into something harder to defend. He tried to retire. He offered to give back his wealth, to remove himself from the imperial circle, to step away from the proximity to power that had defined his adult life. Nero refused, publicly, graciously, with the kind of language that made refusal look like affection. Your wisdom is essential to me. Stay. It was a cage built out of compliments. He stayed because he believed his presence mattered. He stayed because leaving felt like abandonment. He stayed because, perhaps, after so many years of proximity to the center of the world, the idea of a quiet life without that proximity was harder to choose than it should have been for a man who had written so eloquently about the virtues of quiet life. He stayed until staying was no longer a choice he got to make. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE reached into Seneca's life and pulled him under, whether he was actually part of the plot or not. Nero sent a messenger with the order. Seneca received it, according to Tacitus, without visible distress. He told his friends not to weep. He said this was not something he had not seen coming. He went to the bath. He opened his veins. The blood came slowly because he was old. He asked for poison, the hemlock that had killed Socrates. The poison worked only partially. His servants carried him to a bath, hoping the steam would speed what the blood loss and the poison had begun. He died in the bath. He had written, years before, about the importance of dying well, about how the manner of a death reflected the character of the life. He turned his own death into a demonstration of the principles he had spent decades trying to teach. Whether that was courage or performance or both at once, it was the most distinctly Senecan thing he ever did. Back in the palace, his former student heard the news and continued with his day. The man who had spent years trying to answer Plato's question about whether philosophy could guide power had his answer. It could, for a while, under the right conditions, with the right person. And then the conditions change, and the person changes. And what remains is a philosopher in a bath with opened veins and a student who had learned, among other things, that even the wisest people around him were always performing something. In 59 CE, Nero tried to drown his mother in the Bay of Naples. The ship was designed to sink. A section of the hull had been built to collapse on a mechanical trigger, flooding the vessel in open water. Agrippina was invited aboard for a nighttime cruise. Embraced by her son at the dock, with what Tacitus describes as unusual warmth, and sent out onto the water. The ship sank. Agrippina survived. She was a strong swimmer, and she made it to shore. When Nero received the news that she was alive, he did something that no clean narrative of calculated tyranny can quite account for. He panicked. He sent soldiers to her villa, men who found her in her bedroom and killed her there. Ancient tradition preserves the scene with a theatrical intensity that tells you something about how Rome needed to remember this moment. Agrippina, facing the soldiers, asking them to strike her in the womb that had produced such a son, whether every detail of that scene is precisely as the sources present it. The psychological truth Rome wanted to attach to the moment has survived intact for 2,000 years. Before we get to the death, we need to understand what had been building toward it. Because nothing in this story happened suddenly. Nothing in this family ever did. The tension between Nero and Agrippina had been present from the first day of his reign. She had made him emperor, she expected, in the most direct and practical sense, to share the power that came with it. In the first months, she came close. She received foreign ambassadors. She influenced appointments. She was present in ways that had no precedent in Roman imperial history, and that made the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, and Seneca variously uncomfortable for variously overlapping reasons. Then Nero began pushing back. The pushback was initially administrative. Decisions made without consulting her. Appointments that went against her preferences. Small assertions of independence that, taken individually, could have been explained away, but that, taken together, communicated something unmistakable. The project she had built was beginning to develop opinions of its own. She pushed back against the pushback. This was Agrippina. Retreating was not in her nature, and never had been. She began making noise about Britannicus, Claudius's son by his previous marriage, the boy whose claim to the throne was in many ways stronger than Nero's adopted one. She did not work openly to put Britannicus on the throne, but she made sure Nero knew she could play that card if she needed to. Britannicus died at a dinner party in 55 CE. He was 14 years old. The official explanation was an epileptic seizure. Nobody believed it, and nobody said so loudly. With Britannicus gone, the card Agrippina had been holding lost most of its value. But the dynamic between mother and son had already hardened into something that could not be softened back into warmth. She had threatened him, even implicitly. He had shown her what he was willing to do when threatened. There was also a woman. Poppaea Sabina was the wife of one of Nero's friends. And then She was in Nero's orbit. And then, she was the most important person in his personal life. And Agrippina recognized in her the same quality she had always counted on in herself, the complete willingness to do what was necessary. Poppaea wanted to be empress. She told Nero, in whatever private conversations their relationship contained, something that nobody else in his life was telling him, that he was an emperor still living under his mother's control, and that this was something he should change. She was not wrong, and the fact that her advice served her own interests did not make it wrong. What followed was a series of attempts to remove Agrippina from the equation that demonstrated, with painful clarity, that Nero could authorize killing much more easily than he could actually bring himself to execute it. He tried to poison her, multiple times. According to the sources, she was careful with her food and drink. Having grown up in a family where poisoning was a genuine professional hazard, he tried to rig her bedroom ceiling to collapse. She found out. Then the boat, what the boat tells us, beyond the horror of a son trying to drown his mother, is something about the state of Nero's mind at this point in his reign. He was 21 years old. He had the Praetorian Guard, the treasury of the most powerful empire in the world, and the legal authority to order anyone's death with a word. And he was engineering collapsible ships because he could not bring himself to simply issue the order and be done with it. He wanted her gone. He could not look at what wanting her gone actually meant. After the soldiers killed her, Nero went to look at the body. Tacitus records this detail without editorial comment, which is its own kind of editorial comment. A person who had done something enormous and was not able to process the enormity of it for a long time afterward. Nero was plagued by nightmares. He sought out rituals to appease her spirit. He avoided the areas of the palace she had frequented. He left Rome for a period because Rome itself seemed contaminated by what he had done. This is not the behavior of a man who killed without feeling. It is the behavior of a man who killed and then discovered that killing did not solve the problem he thought he was solving. He had wanted to be free of her. He had wanted to be the author of his own story rather than the character in hers. He had wanted to walk into a room and know that every decision he made was his and not an extension of her planning. He got all of that. What he discovered was that the version of himself he found when she was gone was not simply himself. It was himself as she had made him, operating without the structure she had built, making choices with the tools she had given him, in the voice that her tutors had shaped, toward goals that her ambitions had defined before he was old enough to have ambitions of his own. You cannot kill the person who taught you who to be. You can only carry them, and Nero carried Agrippina for the rest of his life. In the nightmares and the rituals and the persistent sense that the freedom he had bought at such a terrible price was not quite the freedom he had thought he was buying. He was 21 years old. He had the whole empire ahead of him, and he was more alone than he had ever been. In 64 CE, in the city of Naples, something happened that no Roman emperor had ever done before, and that the Roman ruling class would spend the next 2,000 years trying to explain away. Nero performed in public, not in a private gathering of trusted friends, not in a carefully managed event for a select audience of people who could be counted on to keep their reactions appropriate, in a proper theater, in front of a proper crowd, as a proper performer competing on the same terms as the professional musicians and singers who made their living doing what he was doing that night. He sang. He played the kithara, the large formal version of the lyre associated with serious musical performance rather than casual entertainment. He stayed on stage for hours, and nobody left. Nobody left because nobody was permitted to leave. The exits were guarded. The audience was expected to remain and to respond with the enthusiasm that the occasion demanded. Ancient writers preserve stories of women giving birth in the theatre, rather than disrupt the performance by departing. Men faking illness or death and having themselves carried out by friends. Because feigning a corpse was apparently preferable to sitting through another hour of imperial singing. One man reportedly dropped from exhaustion, was revived, returned to his seat, and remained there. This is the image that history handed down most vividly, the terror applause. The forced enthusiasm of people who understood that the wrong reaction could have consequences. The theatre full of prisoners watching the most powerful man in the world sing at them. It is a powerful image. It is also incomplete. Here is the part that gets left out. Nero had been preparing for this moment for years. He had studied seriously. He had practiced with the discipline that professional musicians applied to their craft. He had followed the dietary and vocal regimens that performance demanded. He had taken his development as a musician as seriously as any aspect of his public life. Arguably more seriously than most of them. He was not stumbling onto a stage for vanity. He was attempting to do something he had worked at with genuine dedication. In front of an audience. In a city that had a real tradition of musical culture. The problem was not really about the quality of his voice. The problem was about what it meant for the holder of the most powerful office in the known world to stand on a stage and compete in an activity that Roman aristocratic culture classified as low. Actors and musicians in Rome occupied a legally degraded social status. They were infames, a category that included prostitutes and gladiators, and others whose public display of their bodies or skills for money placed them outside the protections of respectable Roman life. When Nero performed, he was not just doing something unusual, he was deliberately placing himself in a category that the entire symbolic architecture of Roman power was built to exclude. The emperor was supposed to be above display, above vulnerability, above the need for public approval. The emperor received approval. He did not seek it. Nero was seeking it, desperately, visibly, in ways that made everyone who witnessed it uncomfortable, because the need behind it was too obvious and too human for the role he was supposed to be filling. Understand what was actually happening in that theatre in Naples. Underneath the political surface of it, here was a person who had spent his entire life being valuable for what he represented, rather than what he did. His bloodline was valuable. His position was valuable. His usefulness to other people's plans was valuable. But he himself, the actual human being, with his particular voice, and his particular musical sensibility, and his particular way of inhabiting a song, had never been asked to show up anywhere as simply himself. On stage, that changed. On stage, the political apparatus fell away. At least in his experience of it, the audience was not responding to the air of Augustus. They were responding to what he was doing in the present moment. Their applause, even forced applause, even terror applause, was at least nominally connected to an actual performance rather than to a title. He needed that connection with a hunger that the palace had produced in him over 2 decades, and that the palace could not satisfy. The Senate was appalled. The old aristocratic families that provided Rome's moral authority were appalled. Seneca understood something about what the performances revealed that simple appalment could not quite capture. Burrus, practical, as always, reportedly said something to the effect that what the emperor did in a theatre in Naples was less dangerous than what he might do if denied the outlet. This was probably true. It was also not a sentence that Burrus could say out loud to the people, demanding he do something about it. Nero heard the appalment and performed anyway. Then he performed again. He took the performances to Rome itself, which was a different and much more politically charged context than Naples, and performed there. He began organizing festivals, the Neronia, events specifically designed to include artistic competitions and to normalize the idea of Roman citizens, including elite ones, participating in Greek-style cultural performance. He was trying to change the culture. He was trying to make the world safe for the kind of person he actually was, by making that kind of person respectable. It was not working. The gap between what he was doing and what the people with the power to write about it thought he should be doing was not closing. It was growing. Every performance that he experienced as an authentic expression of who he was, they experienced as evidence of who an emperor should never be. And here is where the darkness begins to enter. A person who needs external validation as urgently as Nero needed it, and who cannot distinguish between applause given freely and applause given under compulsion, will escalate, will demand more, will remove the possibility of withholding approval because the uncertainty of whether approval is genuine is more unbearable than the certainty of approval that is forced. If everyone is required to clap, you never have to wonder if they mean it. If you never have to wonder if they mean it, you never have to face the possibility that they don't. He said those words in 68 CE, 9 years after Naples. When everything had collapsed and the horses were coming, he still thought of himself, at the end, primarily as an artist. Through all of it, the fire and the conspiracies and the murders and the years of escalating demand, the thing at the center of his self-understanding remained the thing he had reached for in the palace as a boy, when the lyre was the only space that felt genuinely his. He never stopped wanting what he had always wanted. He just kept finding worse and worse ways to try to get it. To understand what happened in July of 64 CE, you need to understand what Rome actually was. Not the Rome of the history books, with its marble temples and triumphal arches and senators in white togas debating the fate of nations. That Rome existed. It was real. It was also about 1% of the city. The other 99% was something different. Rome, in the 1st century CE, was home to somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people, making it almost certainly the largest city in the Western world and one of the largest anywhere on Earth. For a city of that size, in that era, with the technology available to support it, that concentration of human beings required arrangements that no amount of marble architecture could make comfortable or safe. The wealthy lived on the hills. The Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace complex sprawled across prime real estate, was the most obvious example. The elevated ground of Rome was where the people with money lived, in stone houses with proper foundations and enough space between buildings to allow air and light to move. They had gardens. They had running water from the aqueducts that brought clean water into the city from sources miles away. Everyone else lived down. The insulae, the apartment buildings that housed the working population of Rome, went up 6, 7, 8 stories, sometimes higher, built in the valleys and lowlands of the city where the wealthy did not live, packed together along streets so narrow that neighbors on upper floors could theoretically reach across and touch each other's buildings. The ground floors were shops. The floors above were apartments that decreased in quality and increased in danger as you went up. Because the higher you were, the more precarious the structure, and the harder it was to escape when something went wrong. The materials were primarily wood and fired brick, the kind of construction that a landlord trying to maximize units per lot would choose over the kind that a resident trying to survive a fire would choose. The Roman building codes existed and were periodically updated. They were also routinely ignored, because enforcement was difficult, and the demand for housing in an overcrowded city meant that landlords who cut corners had no shortage of tenants regardless. Heat came from open flames. Cooking happened over open flames. Light at night came from oil lamps burning on shelves and tables and in sconces on walls. In a city of close to 1 million people, living in wooden buildings packed along narrow streets, the relationship between daily domestic life and catastrophic fire was not theoretical. It was constant. Rome had burned before Nero and would burn after Nero. Individual fires were regular enough to be unremarkable, localized enough to be contained and forgotten. The vigils, the fire-watching force that Augustus had established, spent their nights moving through the city, watching for the glow that meant someone's oil lamp had tipped over. Someone's cooking fire had caught a curtain. Someone's neighbor had not been careful enough. They could not watch everywhere at once. Now, add to this physical reality a social one. The population of Rome was not a unified community with shared interests and mutual support. It was an enormously stratified collection of people from every part of the empire and beyond, speaking dozens of languages, practicing dozens of religions, occupying every possible position on the economic spectrum, from the immensely wealthy to the genuinely desperate. A city of close to 1 million people with no adequate sanitation, no reliable food distribution, no system for managing the tensions between communities that had nothing in common except geography. And at the top of all of this, literally and figuratively, was Nero, living in the palace on the Palatine Hill, above the smoke and the noise and the smell that were the constant texture of the city below him, governing an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, while the people at the center of that empire lived in buildings that a single lamp could destroy. He knew Rome was overcrowded. He knew the housing was dangerous. There had been proposals over the years for urban renewal, for widening streets, for replacing the most dangerous structures with something safer. These things cost money and disrupted the property interests of powerful people and moved slowly through the administrative processes of an empire with many other things to manage. Rome was not a city waiting for a villain to set it on fire. Rome was a city that had been building toward catastrophe for decades. Through neglect and overcrowding and the accumulated consequences of 1 million individual decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and were collectively creating conditions that the vigiles, for all their dedication, could not indefinitely contain. In July of 64 CE, Nero was at his villa in Antium, on the coast, about 30 miles south of Rome. He was not in the city when something, in the area near the Circus Maximus, began to burn. What happened next lasted 9 days and changed the history of the ancient world, not because of who started it, but because of what a city in crisis does with the story of how its disaster began. A city on fire needs a reason. It needs the fire to mean something. And meaning, in Rome in 64 CE, had a face. On the night of July 18th, 64 CE, fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus was the largest entertainment venue in Rome, a structure that could hold somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people, depending on which ancient source you trust. Its ground level was lined with shops and storage spaces and the kind of commercial infrastructure that accumulates around any place where large crowds gather regularly. These spaces were full of goods that burned. The fire caught the way fires catch in overcrowded cities, which is to say quickly and completely and in multiple directions at once. The narrow streets that connected the commercial district to the surrounding neighborhoods were not barriers. They were channels. The wind that came off the hills that night moved the fire with it, and the buildings that stood in its path were the buildings they had always been wood and fired brick, and the optimistic engineering of landlords who had never planned for this specific night. By the time the vigiles understood what they were dealing with, it was no longer a fire. It was an event. The accounts that survive describe what happened over the ensuing 9 days in terms that carry the weight of people trying to describe something their language had not prepared them for. Tacitus, writing roughly 50 years after the fact, but drawing on sources much closer to it, describes people running in every direction. The sick and the elderly left behind, the narrow streets filling with crowds moving against each other, some trying to escape and some trying to return for possessions, and the fire finding its way through all of them. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were affected. 3 were destroyed completely. The fires reached the Palatine Hill itself, which meant the fire reached the palace, which meant the fire reached the symbolic center of Roman power. When the blaze finally subsided after 9 days, the city that had been the undisputed capital of the Western world looked, in significant portions, like something that had ended. Now, here is where history gets complicated. The question of what actually caused the fire, and whether Nero had any role in starting it, is a question that the sources raise and that the evidence cannot settle. This is not a mystery that additional research will one day resolve. It is a case where the evidence available, assessed honestly, produces genuine uncertainty rather than a suppressed truth waiting to be uncovered. Here is what we actually know. Nero was not in Rome when the fire began. He was at his villa in Antium. This is consistent across the sources, including the hostile ones. When news of the fire reached him, he returned to Rome. He organized relief efforts. He opened his own gardens and public buildings as emergency shelter for people who had lost their homes. He brought in food supplies. He supervised the firefighting operations personally, going into dangerous areas in ways that put him at physical risk. These are not the actions that the story of Nero playing his lyre while Rome burned suggests. That story, one of the most persistent images in popular history, is almost certainly not what happened. Tacitus himself, who was not inclined toward charitable readings of Nero, does not report the lyre story as established fact. He reports it as something people said, something that circulated in the city in the days after the fire. The version that has come down through 2,000 years of retelling is a rumor that became a legend, that became accepted truth. The way these things happen when a story is too satisfying to subject to scrutiny. The more serious claim, and the one that Tacitus treats more carefully, is that Nero wanted the fire to happen because he wanted the land it cleared. The theory is that the destruction of the crowded neighborhoods at the heart of Rome gave him the space he needed for the massive building project he would undertake afterward. The Golden House, which occupied a vast tract of land in the center of the city that had been residential and commercial before the fire. This is more plausible than the lyre story and less provable than the people who cite it. Nero certainly did build the Golden House on cleared land. He certainly did benefit, in a material sense, from the destruction. But the inference from, benefited from, to caused, requires evidence that does not exist in the historical record in any form that can bear the weight placed on it. What is equally possible, and what the physical reality of Rome supports, is that the fire started the way fires started constantly in that city, accidentally, in an overcrowded commercial district, under conditions that had made catastrophic fire a matter of when rather than if, for decades. Tacitus, to his credit, actually shows his work here more than he usually does. He does not say Nero burned Rome as a fact. He says that opinion was divided, that some believed it was accidental, that others believed it was ordered. He notes the relief efforts that Nero organized. And then, in the same passage, he pivots to the Christians, who, according to his account, became the official explanation for the fire. Here is where we need to slow down, because this is one of the most consequential pivots in the history of Western civilization, and it deserves more care than it usually gets. Tacitus writes that Nero, facing popular suspicion that he had ordered the fire, identified a group called Christians as responsible and subjected them to punishment. He describes these punishments in terms that are graphic and that, if his account reflects what happened, represent one of the earliest systematic actions against Christians by Roman authority. He describes people being sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, people being set on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. And then he writes something remarkable. He writes that even people who felt the Christians deserved punishment were moved to pity by the spectacle of it. Coming from Tacitus, a man who called their faith a destructive superstition in the same passage. That word carries real weight. It means that what he was describing had crossed a line that even hostile observers could feel. The fire lasted 9 days. The story of the fire has lasted 2,000 years. They are not the same story. The 9-day fire was a catastrophe of urban infrastructure, the consequence of a city that had been building toward exactly this moment for generations. The 2,000-year story is about what Seneca need to believe when disaster strikes, about what kind of explanation allows grief to become something livable, about what happens when a person in power becomes the face of a loss that has no face. We do not know whether Nero started the fire. We know, with complete certainty, that the fire started the final act of his story. And we know that the two things, what happened and what was remembered about what happened, were never quite the same thing, and that the gap between them is not a flaw in the historical record. It is the historical record. There is a number in a text written toward the end of the 1st century CE that readers for 2,000 years have argued over 666, the number of the beast, the mark of ultimate evil, the signature of the enemy of everything, the text's community held sacred. Later, Christian interpretation connected this number through a reading practice that assigned numerical values to letters, to the name Nero Caesar. The calculation works through the Hebrew spelling of his name, and related textual readings have kept the discussion alive among scholars for a very long time. The text itself never names Nero directly. For many early readers, and for many later interpreters, one name would have echoed behind that image, Nero. To understand how he became the emperor that Christians never forgot, you need to understand who the Christians in Rome actually were in 64 CE. They were not the institution that would eventually reshape the Western world. They were a small community, probably a few thousand people in a city of close to 1 million, practicing a religion centered on the belief that a man executed by Roman authority in Judea had risen from the dead. To most Romans, if they were aware of this group at all, they were a subset of the Jewish community, which was itself a group that Romans found culturally baffling but had largely learned to tolerate. The Christians were, in the Roman imagination of 64 CE, Not a major category. They were a footnote. They were also, crucially, a group with no political power, no wealthy patrons, no military connections, and no ability to effectively defend themselves against official action. When Tacitus describes Nero, identifying them as responsible for the fire, the practical logic of that identification, whatever its relationship to truth, was straightforward. They were available, they were foreign-seeming. They were already viewed with suspicion by neighbors who found their refusal to participate in the normal religious life of the city strange and antisocial. They could not fight back. Tacitus writes about what followed with a quality of discomfort that is, coming from him, almost remarkable. He was not sympathetic to Christians. He describes their faith as a destructive superstition, which tells you exactly where he stood on the theological question. But he was a man with a serious commitment to a particular understanding of Roman dignity and Roman law. And what he describes in the aftermath of the fire does not sit well within that understanding. He uses the word pity, coming from Tacitus, writing about a group he had just described as practitioners of a destructive superstition. That word carries weight. It means that what he was describing had crossed a line that even hostile observers could feel, part of why Nero became the emperor that Christians remembered most vividly, above others, who would also become symbols of imperial violence, is the specific memory of those actions. Part of it is Peter and Paul, the two figures most central to the early church, who, according to Christian tradition, were both martyred in Rome during Nero's reign. If that tradition is accurate, then the first generation of Christian leadership died in Nero's Rome, and that fact would have been impossible for the community to set aside. The early church carried that memory forward with the particular intensity of people who had built their identity around the story of what they had survived. Nero did not just persecute them. In their memory, he became the template, the first face of the empire turned against faith, the model against which all future persecution would be measured. In later Christian imagination, as the beast, as the shadow behind Babylon, as the name that could not quite be spoken directly but that echoed through the imagery of the end times, the smoke from the fire of 64 CE had long since cleared over Rome. The smoke in the memory of the early church never did. When the fires finally went out and the smoke cleared enough for people to see what was left of Rome, Nero made a decision that would define how history remembered him more than almost anything else he ever did. He built, not for the city, not first, not primarily, for himself, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was not a palace in the ordinary sense of that word. It was something that did not have a precedent in Roman history, and that the Romans who lived to see it completed struggled to describe without reaching for language that mixed wonder and horror in roughly equal measure. Suetonius writes that its entrance hall was large enough to contain a statue of Nero, 120 feet tall, that the complex included a lake, artificial, but large enough to be called a sea, surrounded by buildings designed to look like cities around a harbor, that the dining rooms had ceilings fitted with rotating panels that could shower guests with flowers or perfume from hidden pipes above, that every surface was covered in gold and jewels and mother of pearl. The name said it plainly, the Golden House. It occupied a vast tract of land in the center of Rome, stretching across multiple hills and down into the valley between them, one of the largest private residences Rome had ever seen. Built in the years immediately following the fire, built on ground that the fire had cleared, built while the people who had lived on that ground were rebuilding their lives in the tent cities and temporary housing that Nero had opened his own properties to accommodate. The timing was the message. Or rather, the timing was the message that everyone received. Regardless of whether it was the message Nero intended to send, what Nero apparently intended to communicate, based on the records of what he said about the project, was something about human dignity and the proper scale of human ambition. The famous line attributed to him, that he could finally begin to live like a human being, was not meant as an expression of contempt for the people who had lost their homes. It was meant, in his own understanding of it, as a statement about what he had always deserved and never had space. His own space, a place built to his specifications, reflecting his aesthetic, answering his imagination rather than the accumulated precedents of every emperor who had come before him. He had grown up in palaces that belonged to dynasties, in spaces designed to communicate institutional power rather than individual character. The Golden House was the first place he had ever built from nothing, shaped according to his own vision of what beauty was and what a life well lived looked like. The architects, a man named Severus working with an engineer named Seneca, were given instructions that seemed to amount to, "This make it feel like the world itself," rather than like a building trying to contain the world. The gardens were designed to look as though they had grown naturally, rather than been planted. The rotating dining room ceiling was designed to display different configurations of the sky. The scale was designed not to intimidate but to open, to give a person the physical experience of not being hemmed in on every side by obligation and ceremony. This was a person who had spent his life inside rooms built for power and who wanted, for once, to be inside a room built for beauty. The problem was not the vision. The problem was the location. Rome had reconstruction policies that Nero implemented in the aftermath of the fire, and they were, by the standards of ancient urban planning, genuinely progressive. Streets were widened, building heights were limited, fire breaks were required between structures, stone and concrete replaced wood in many areas, water supply was improved. These policies cost money and took years and benefited the city in ways that lasted beyond Nero's reign. They are almost never mentioned in accounts of what he did after the fire, because they do not fit the narrative that had already begun to form. What fit the narrative was the Golden House. What fit the narrative was the emperor building his pleasure palace on the ruins of the city his people had lost. Tacitus captures the response of the Roman population with a precision that reveals why ancient political instincts were sometimes more sophisticated than modern observers give them credit for. The complaint was not simply that the Golden House was extravagant. Rome had always had extravagant rulers and had accommodated the fact with its usual combination of grumbling and compliance. The complaint was about what the extravagance communicated at this particular moment. In this particular context, as a statement about the relationship between the emperor and the people he governed, a city had burned. People had lost everything. And the most visible thing the emperor did with the cleared ground was build a lake in his garden. You did not need a philosophy degree to understand what that said about whose loss mattered and whose did not. Nero may have understood this intellectually and found himself unable to stop. He may not have understood it at all. Sealed inside the particular blindness that power creates when it has operated long enough without serious resistance to its assumptions. He may have understood it and proceeded anyway, with the specific recklessness of a person who has stopped caring what the people around him think because he has spent his life watching his actual choices not matter to the people who claim to care about him. When Nero reportedly walked through the finished complex for the first time and said it was finally fit for a human being, the senators who heard this report filed it away alongside everything else they were filing away. The architects who built it produced something that later generations would study with genuine admiration, something whose technical innovations were impressive enough to survive the contempt in which its patron was held. After Nero died, the emperors who followed him did the politically necessary thing. Vespasian drained the artificial lake and built the Colosseum in its place, a public entertainment space on the ground where Nero's private pleasure had been. The Golden House itself was filled in, its rooms used as foundations for the baths of Trajan built above them. The building was buried under the city it had tried to stand above. The rooms went dark. They would stay dark for nearly 1,500 years. What was inside those rooms, waiting in that darkness, is a story for later. What matters now is what the Golden House did to the living, to the senators watching the construction rise on cleared land, to the people rebuilding their homes in the same years the imperial gardens were being planted, to the writers who were, even then, beginning to assemble the story of Nero that would outlast the palace, outlast the empire, outlast almost everything except the question itself. The problem was not the vision. The problem was the location. And when the two cannot be separated, the vision pays the price. In 65 CE, approximately 41 people were killed or forced to commit suicide in connection with a plot to assassinate Nero and replace him with a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Among those 41 was Seneca. The Pisonian conspiracy, as it is known, was either the most serious threat to Nero's reign and a genuine near miss at changing the course of Roman history, or a partially fabricated crisis that a paranoid emperor used to eliminate people he had wanted to eliminate for other reasons, or something in between those two things that the evidence cannot settle into a clean shape. What it unquestionably was, regardless of how much of it was real and how much was manufactured, was the moment the performance Nero had been giving since he was 16 years old began to visibly break apart. The conspiracy was betrayed by a freedwoman named Epicharis, who had apparently been trying to recruit members of the fleet at Misenum and was arrested when one of the people she approached reported her to the authorities. Under torture, she revealed nothing. She died during her interrogation, having told them less than they already knew from other sources. Tacitus notes her fortitude with the particular admiration he reserved for people who died well, and notes with considerably less admiration that the free-born and prominent men of the conspiracy, when it was their turn, talked considerably more than she had. The arrests spread. Each person arrested named others. Each naming led to new arrests, new interrogations, new names. The circle widened through the senatorial and equestrian classes, through the officer corps of the Praetorian Guard, through the literary and artistic circles that had been the social world of elite Rome under Nero. Seneca's name came up. Whether this was accurate, whether the man who named him was telling the truth or fabricating under pressure, whether Seneca had genuine knowledge of the plot or was simply someone the conspirators had discussed as a potential figurehead, is a question that Tacitus himself declines to answer definitively. What he records is a tribune arriving at Seneca's house with a message from Nero. The message reported what had been said against him. It offered him the opportunity to respond. Seneca responded, according to Tacitus, with equanimity. He said his conversations with Piso had been limited and ordinary. He said he had no reason to value Piso's life over his own. He said what a Stoic philosopher in his position was supposed to say, which was that death held no terror for a person who had made peace with it through a life of proper thinking. The tribune returned to Nero with this response. Another message was sent. Seneca was to die. He was at dinner with his wife Paulina and two friends when the message arrived. He told them not to weep. He said he had long prepared for this. He may have believed it. He had been writing about the preparation for death for decades. He cut the veins in his arms. The blood came slowly because he was old. He asked for poison, the hemlock that had killed Socrates. The poison worked only partially. His servants carried him to a bath, hoping the steam would speed what the blood loss and the poison had begun. He died in the bath. Paulina had cut her own veins when Seneca cut his. Nero, when he heard this, sent word that she should be saved. She was bandaged and survived, living for years after her husband's death with what Tacitus describes as notably pale arms. Then there was Petronius. Petronius was the man Nero's court called the arbiter of elegance, the person whose aesthetic judgment set the standard for what Roman sophistication looked like. The author of the Satyricon, a work whose survival across 2 millennia is itself a kind of miracle. He was forced to die around the same time. Whether through genuine connection to the conspiracy or simply because he had accumulated enough enemies to make the crisis a convenient opportunity, his death is the most deliberate in the entire episode. He opened his veins. He bandaged them. He opened them again. He had dinner with friends. Not a solemn Last Supper, but an apparently relaxed and enjoyable meal at which the conversation was about pleasant things. Deliberately, consciously, refusing to give death the dramatic weight that Roman tradition assigned to it. He listened to music. He gave away gifts from his household. He fell asleep and died without ceremony. Nero treated his own life as theatre. Petronius treated his death as the opposite of theatre. He refused the stage. He refused to give the emperor the dramatic ending that would have made the whole thing feel significant and ordered and properly concluded. Whether Nero understood the reproach is not recorded. What is recorded is what came after 65 CE. Nero governed differently. He executed people on thinner evidence than he had previously required. He withdrew from the kinds of consultation that had characterized the earlier years of his reign. He began doing things that made it clear he no longer felt obligated to manage the perceptions of the people who had already, apparently, been managing their perceptions of him. Here is the mechanism of what happened to him in those months. Underneath the political surface of it, a man who cannot distinguish genuine applause from compelled applause, and who discovers that the people applauding him were doing so while planning his murder, does not become more reasonable. He becomes more extreme. He removes the possibility of withholding approval because the knowledge that approval can be withheld is now unbearable in a way it was not before. Every performance has a moment when the performer realizes the audience is not with them. Most performers have the option of walking off the stage. Nero did not have that option. He kept performing, and the audience, which had been deciding for years that it was done with the show, was already planning what would come after the curtain fell. In the autumn of 66 CE, Nero left Rome. He took with him a retinue of 5,000 people, performers, musicians, soldiers, servant, officials, the full travelling apparatus of an imperial court on the move. He crossed the Adriatic and landed in Greece. And for the next 15 months, he did something that no Roman emperor had ever done, and that none would ever do again. He competed, not in war, not in politics, not in the administrative competitions of empire building, where the stakes were provinces and armies and the lives of thousands. He competed in the games, the musical competitions, the athletic contests, the artistic festivals that were the cultural heartbeat of the Greek world and that had been running In some cases, for 700 years before Nero arrived to enter them. He sang in the theatrical competitions at the Pythian Games at Delphi, where the prize was a laurel wreath, and the judges were men who had spent their lives evaluating musical performance. He raced chariots at Olympia, on the same track where Greeks had been racing for centuries, where the soil had been pressed by the feet of every great athlete of the ancient world. He entered the dramatic competitions at the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games, performing in festivals that predated the Roman Empire by centuries and that operated according to traditions Rome had never been able to fully absorb or replace. He was awarded victory everywhere he competed. Ancient accounts suggest that his victories were shaped, at least in part, by the pressure of competing against an emperor. At Olympia, according to Suetonius, he fell from his chariot during the race, was helped back in by attendants, remounted, and was still given the victory despite not finishing the course. The judges, it seems reasonable to infer, understood that second place was not a position the Emperor of Rome was expected to occupy, and yet the standard telling almost always stops there, at the rigged competitions, at the absurdity of an emperor collecting prizes he could not have earned on level terms. It stops there because stopping there makes the story simple. Here is what that telling leaves out. The Greek world had a long tradition of treating artistic excellence as genuinely noble, as a mark of character rather than a degradation of status. A man who sang well, who drove a chariot with skill, who could hold an audience with his voice, was not an embarrassment in Greece. He was someone who had mastered something worth mastering. The Greek understanding of human excellence had been built, for centuries, around precisely the capacities that Rome told Nero he should be ashamed of. He did not simply visit Greece, in some sense that the word home can carry beyond geography. He went home. The response of the Greek population to Nero was warmer than anything Rome's elite had given him. Whether this was because they genuinely appreciated his performances, or because a province that received an emperor's personal attention tended to respond with something resembling enthusiasm, or some combination of both. The experience of being in Greece was different for Nero than the experience of being anywhere else in his adult life. He was not the emperor who had humiliated the Senate. He was not the son who had killed his mother. He was a man who sang and raced and competed, and the people in front of him responded to the competing. Then, in 67 CE, standing before an assembled crowd at the Isthmian Games at Corinth, Nero made an announcement that stunned everyone present. He declared the province of Achaia free from Roman taxation, free from the obligation to house Roman troops, free to govern itself under its own laws in ways that other Roman provinces were not permitted. The entire province, millions of people, lifted out of the administrative subordination that Roman rule imposed, by the voice of one man standing on a stage at a games festival. The crowd's response was overwhelming. People wept. They reached toward him. They called out in ways that the Roman officials traveling with Nero recorded with the discomfort of people witnessing a dynamic they did not know how to categorize. This was not the performed enthusiasm of a Roman audience that understood the consequences of insufficient applause. This was something that looked, from the outside, like genuine feeling. Nero wept too. This is the detail that matters most, and that is most often passed over in the standard accounts. A man who had spent 15 months touring Greece, performing and competing, and being received with a warmth he had never experienced in Rome, standing before a crowd that was responding to him as a human being rather than as an office. Crying, He freed an entire province for this feeling. He used the most absolute power available to any person in the world at that moment. The power to rewrite the legal status of millions of people, not for strategic advantage, not for military necessity, not for any of the reasons that Roman emperors deployed their power, but because he wanted to be loved by the people in front of him, and this was the largest thing he could give them. He gave away a province the way a person in love gives away something they cannot actually afford, because the feeling of giving it is worth more than the thing. Vespasian, the emperor who came after Nero, revoked the freedom of Achaia almost immediately. He said the Greeks were an ungrateful people who had forgotten how to be free. He may have been right in the narrow, administrative sense. That freedom, given on impulse by an emperor at an emotional moment, was not the same as freedom built on durable, legal, and institutional foundations. But that is the argument of governance. It is not the argument Nero was having with himself in that moment at Corinth. He collected the prizes from his competitions. By the end of the tour, he had accumulated 1,808 prizes, a number so specific that it probably came from official records and carries the weight of something Nero himself kept careful track of. More prizes than any competitor in the history of the games, a number so large that it speaks, more than any essay or analysis could, to what he was counting and why. He sailed back to Rome in late 67 or early 68 CE. He entered the city through a breach made in the city wall, in the tradition of a general returning from a triumph. He rode through the streets in the chariot that Augustus had used. He wore a purple robe covered in gold stars. The crowds were enormous. He processed from the Circus Maximus to the Capitoline Hill to the Palatine, and the city turned out to watch. He was bringing home the prizes. 1,808 crowns of laurel and olive and celery, the symbols of victory in the ancient world, displayed in the procession like the standards of conquered armies, in Galba's headquarters in Spain. A man who had spent 30 years as a loyal servant of the Roman state was reading reports from Rome and drawing conclusions. In the Rhine legions, officers who had watched the emperor spend 15 months touring Greek theatres were having conversations about the nature of loyalty and what it was owed to. In the Senate, men who had survived the years of paranoia were looking at each other and calculating with renewed urgency. The empire had waited for him while he was in Greece. It had not waited happily. It had not waited loyally. It had waited the way a structure waits when the supports holding it up have been quietly compromised, and nobody has yet done anything that would make the compromise visible. Nero walked through his city, carrying his 1,808 prizes, and the city cheered. And somewhere in the cheering was the sound of the audience that was done. He could not hear the difference. He had never been able to hear the difference. In March of 68 CE, a man named Gaius Julius Vindex stood up in Gaul and said that Nero was unfit to govern. Vindex was the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, a Roman province in what is now central France, and he was a Gaul by ancestry, the son of a family that had received Roman citizenship under an earlier emperor. He was not, in the first instance, proposing himself as an alternative emperor. He was proposing that Rome needed a better one. His rebellion was, in military terms, unsuccessful. The Rhine legions engaged Vindex's forces at Vesontio and defeated them. Vindex himself died, whether by suicide or in battle. The sources do not agree. His army was dispersed. By the conventional metrics of military rebellion, the thing was over before it properly began. But something had happened that the military outcome could not undo. Vindex had said it out loud. He had taken the calculation that everyone in the empire had been quietly doing for years. The comparison of what Nero cost against what Nero provided. And he had spoken it in public with an army behind it. The calculation was no longer a private matter. It was a political event. And political events, once they occur, cannot be made to have not occurred by winning a battle against the person who initiated them. Galba was the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, one of the Spanish provinces, and he was 68 years old and had spent his entire adult life in the service of Rome. He was, by temperament and history, the opposite of Nero in almost every way: old, austerer, traditional, a man who believed in the Republic's values, even as he had spent his career serving what was functionally an autocracy. When Vindex made contact with him before the rebellion and asked him to consider offering himself as an alternative emperor, Galba had demurred. After Vesontio, after Vindex was dead and his army was gone, Galba looked at the situation again. He had received a message summoning him to Rome. In the language of Nero's late reign, a summons from Rome was not an invitation. It was an announcement of the emperor's intentions. Galba was old enough and experienced enough to understand that going to Rome meant not coming back. He stood before his troops in Spain and accepted their acclamation as emperor. He was careful, at first, about the language. He called himself not emperor, but legate of the Senate and the Roman people, a phrase that deliberately invoked republican traditions, that positioned what he was doing not as a seizure of power, but as a restoration of legitimate governance against an illegitimate ruler. The framing mattered. It was aimed at the Senate, at the other legions, at everyone who needed a way to justify to themselves what they were about to do. In Rome, the news arrived in pieces and was received in ways that told you everything about the state of Nero's hold on power. The Senate did not immediately rally to defend the emperor. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had been the instrument of imperial succession for 3 generations, was having its own conversations. Its prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, was telling the guardsmen that Nero had already fled, that the emperor was gone, that the practical question was no longer whether to support Nero, but how to position themselves for what came next. This was not true. Nero had not fled. But the statement was made, and the guard chose to believe it, because the guard understood which way the wind was blowing, and choosing to believe it was easier than choosing to act on the truth. Nero was not captured by a foreign enemy. He was not defeated in battle. He was not overthrown in a palace coup by a rival with a superior claim and a better army. He was abandoned, person by person, institution by institution. The people and structures that had constituted his practical power simply removed themselves from the equation. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard accepted money from Galba's representatives and transferred its loyalty. The treasury was, in practical terms, no longer Nero's. The officers and officials who remained in his immediate circle that night dwindled through the evening hours. He woke at some point in the night to find that even the servants who had been around him had left. He sent messages to friends asking for refuge. Some did not respond. Some responded with regrets. One man, a freedman named Phaon, offered his villa outside Rome. Nero rode there with 4 companions through the pre-dawn dark, covering his face. Hearing the sound of troops celebrating Galba somewhere in the night, he arrived at the villa and was brought to a room and told to wait. He waited. He asked his companions to dig a grave for him. He helped them dig. He gathered pieces of marble and said they were for his monument. He wept. He said, several times, in several formulations, what a loss this death was going to be for the world. The horses came. The order that reached his location was the Senate's order. Death in the ancient manner. And Nero knew what that meant. Stripped. Baton. Head locked in a yoke. The most humiliating execution Roman law had available. He put the blade to his throat. His hand shook. He could not do it. He looked at Epaphroditus, standing beside him, and asked him to help. Epaphroditus helped him. The horseman who arrived moments later found him still breathing, barely, and knelt beside him and pressed a cloth to the wound. Nero looked at him and said, according to Suetonius, too late, but this is loyalty. Publius Cornelius Tacitus was born around 56 CE, during Nero's reign, and was perhaps 8 or 10 years old when Nero died. He would grow up to become the greatest historian Rome ever produced, a writer whose prose has a quality of compressed moral intelligence that is still felt across the distance of 2,000 years. His account of Nero in the Annals is the foundation of almost everything the Western world has believed about that emperor ever since. He was also a senator. This matters more than it might initially appear to matter. Tacitus was not a neutral observer, compiling evidence with dispassionate care. He was a member of the class that Nero had humiliated, frightened, and killed. He had lived through the reign of Domitian, another emperor who made senators afraid, and he was writing under Trajan, an emperor celebrated precisely because he governed with respect for senatorial dignity and traditional aristocratic values. When Tacitus sat down to write about Nero, he was writing from inside a very specific set of experiences, for a very specific audience, with a very specific understanding of what the story meant and what it was for. Tacitus should not be dismissed as simply fabricating. That is the crucial thing to understand. And it is the thing that gets lost when people try to rehabilitate historical figures by throwing out the hostile sources entirely. He was not making things up. He was selecting. He was interpreting. He was applying the moral framework of a Roman senator of the early 2nd century to events that had happened decades earlier, drawing on sources and oral traditions that had their own angles and emphases, shaping a narrative that would make sense to his readers and carry the weight of the lessons he believed history should teach. His Nero is a coherent portrait. It is psychologically plausible. It contains details that archaeology and other evidence have confirmed. It is written by someone who clearly thought hard about cause and effect, about how a person becomes what they become, about the relationship between character and circumstance. It is also written by someone who had decided, before he began, what the story meant, and that decision shaped everything what he included, what he left out, which rumors he treated as fact, and which facts he treated as uncertain, which of Nero's actions he read as evidence of calculation, and which he read as evidence of impulse. Suetonius wrote his Lives of the 12 Caesars around the same time as Tacitus, in the early 2nd century CE. He had access to the imperial archives, which gave him details that no other ancient writer preserved, and he used them with the enthusiasm of a man who loved a good story. His Nero is the most vivid, the most anecdote-rich, the most immediately readable version. It is also the least concerned with context. It's the most willing to present the worst interpretation of any ambiguous event, the most satisfying if what you want is a portrait of a monster rather than a portrait of a person. Suetonius gives us the rotating ceilings of the Golden House. He gives us the theatre where nobody could leave. He gives us the image of Nero performing while Rome burned, which, as we have seen, is not what Tacitus actually reports as established fact, but which has become the dominant image in popular memory. He gives us the voice described as small and husky. He gives us the chariot race at Olympia, where Nero fell and was still awarded the victory. Suetonius was not writing to understand Nero. He was writing to describe him, selecting the details that capture a recognizable essence, arranging them for maximum effect, creating an image that feels complete, even if it is composed from the most dramatic available materials. Then there is Cassius Dio, writing his Roman history in the early 3rd century CE, roughly 150 years after Nero's death. By the time he was writing, Nero had already moved closer to moral legend than living memory. The specific texture of daily life in his court, the actual human dynamics of what it felt like to be in those rooms, the nuances of how decisions were made and why. All of that had been replaced by the accumulated tradition of how Nero was supposed to be understood. His Nero is the most extreme, the most theatrical, the most willing to present as established fact things that Tacitus had carefully flagged as rumor or uncertain. Read across all three of them, from Tacitus to Suetonius to Cassius Dio, and you can watch Nero becoming Nero. You can see the process by which a complicated human being, with real virtues and real failures and real damage and real talent, is distilled into something simpler and more usable. The nuances fall away. The complicating details get dropped. The things that made him sympathetic or at least understandable get buried under the things that make him monstrous. This is not a process unique to Nero. It is what happens to almost everyone that history remembers. The demands of memory, of narrative, of moral lesson, all push toward simplification. A person who was many things becomes the thing they are most useful for being. Nero was most useful as the worst emperor, as the absolute negative example, the ruler against whom every subsequent ruler could be measured and found less terrible, as proof of what unchecked power does to a person and what a person with unchecked power can do to a city. There is also the question of who was writing about Nero in traditions that were not Roman and not senatorial. The early Christian writers who mentioned Nero were not primarily concerned with his governance or his aesthetics or his relationship with the Senate. They were concerned with the persecution, with the martyrs, with the memory of what Rome had done to their community under his authority. Their Nero was not a failed artist or a damaged psyche or a product of a dysfunctional dynasty. Their Nero was the enemy of God's people, the first face of the imperial power that would spend centuries trying to destroy what could not be destroyed. Two traditions, the senatorial tradition and the Christian tradition, they did not agree on most things. They came from different worlds, valued different things, and were often actively hostile to each other. But they agreed on Nero. When two powerful and durable traditions both need the same person to be the monster, that person becomes the monster in the record that history inherits. This does not mean the construction is false. It means the construction is a construction. It means that what we have inherited is not Nero, but the uses to which Nero has been put by people across 20 centuries who needed something from him. A cautionary tale, a monster to measure other monsters against. A symbol of the gap between power and wisdom, between performance and governance, between what a ruler wants and what a ruler owes. These are real needs. The uses are legitimate. History without moral weight is just a list of events. But the moral weight should not be confused with the man. The man was someone we can only partially see, through sources that are partial by nature, describing a life that was more complicated than any source had reason to fully capture. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: he was born into a system that had no good way to make a decent emperor. He was raised by a woman who was extraordinary and who shaped him in ways he could never fully escape. He was educated by a philosopher who genuinely tried and genuinely failed to answer one of philosophy's oldest questions. He governed, for a while, with more competence than his legend allows. He performed, with more earnestness than his mockers credited. He killed people who did not deserve to die, which is true of most people who hold absolute power and is true of him in ways that cannot be mitigated or excused. The other question, the one about the person underneath the symbol, remains open. It has always remained open. That openness is not a failure of the historical record. It is the most honest thing the historical record contains. In the year 69 CE, 1 year after Nero's death, a man appeared in Greece claiming to be Nero. He was not Nero. He was probably a freed slave, or possibly a soldier, who had learned to play the kithara and who bore some physical resemblance to the late emperor, or claimed to. He gathered followers. He sailed toward the eastern Mediterranean. He gained enough support among the communities he passed through to cause genuine alarm in Rome. He was eventually captured and executed. The threat he represented lasted only months. In 79 CE, 11 years after Nero's death, another man appeared in the eastern provinces, claiming to be Nero returned. He had supporters. He operated for a period before being suppressed. In 88 or 89 CE, 20 years after Nero's death, a third claimant appeared, this time with Parthian support, which moved the situation from nuisance to international incident. Rome had to negotiate for his surrender. The Parthian king, who understood perfectly well that the man was not Nero, apparently found the diplomatic leverage of harboring someone Rome wanted removed to be worth the awkwardness of the pretense. 3 false Neros. Across 20 years. All of them in the eastern provinces. All of them drawing support from populations that the standard Roman sources largely ignored. The standard explanation for the false Neros is that they exploited popular credulity, that the people who followed them were gullible or desperate, that the phenomenon tells us nothing meaningful about Nero himself beyond the fact that his face was recognizable enough to be imitated. That explanation is too easy and too convenient. It answers the surface question while avoiding the deeper one. Why would anyone in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, in the decades after Nero's death, want to believe that Nero was still alive? The answer requires stepping back from the sources that shaped the dominant picture of Nero and asking who is missing from those sources. Tacitus was a senator. Suetonius was an imperial archivist and biographer of the elite. Cassius Dio was a senator of Greek origin, writing for educated Greek audiences. These were people whose experience of Nero was the experience of proximity to power. They lived in Rome, or in circles adjacent to Rome. They experienced Nero's reign as senators experienced it, as members of the equestrian class experienced it, as the educated professional class experienced it. They did not experience it as a grain farmer in Syria might have experienced it. They did not experience it as a dock worker in Alexandria might have experienced it. They did not experience it as the population of Achaia experienced it. the province that Nero had freed from taxation in 67 CE. A decision that Vespasian reversed almost immediately after taking power, but that had been real for the people who lived under it. Briefly, completely real. To those people, the Nero question looked different. Nero had put on games. He had distributed food. He had rebuilt Rome after the fire, with policies that produced wider streets and safer buildings that benefited the urban poor more than they benefited anyone else. He had freed a province. However, briefly, from a tax burden that fell most heavily on people who could least afford to pay it. He had not been the emperor of remote dignity and administrative efficiency that the senatorial tradition valued. He had been present, visible, loud, performing in public, seeking approval from audiences that included people who were not senators. He had wanted the crowd to love him. Some of the crowd did, not the crowd that wrote history. Now, here is the thing worth being careful about. None of this makes Nero a good ruler. It means only that bad rulers can still be remembered differently by different people, depending on what part of their rule actually touched their lives. The grain farmer in Syria and the senator in Rome experienced the same reign through entirely different windows. What they saw through those windows was not the same thing. The false Neros were not sustained by credulity alone. They were sustained by a population that had reasons to prefer the memory of Nero to the reality of his successors. Galba, who came after Nero, was famous for saying that he chose his soldiers. He did not buy them. A statement that sounds like virtue from one angle, and like a man who did not understand political reality from another. He lasted 7 months before the Praetorian Guard killed him. The men who replaced Nero were not obviously improvements to people whose lives were shaped by tax rates and food prices, and whether the emperor was the kind of person who showed up in person to a fire rather than sending officials. They restored the traditional hierarchies that Nero had scrambled. They reversed the province freedoms he had granted. They reinstated the senatorial dignity he had offended. For the people who had benefited from the offending, the restoration was the problem. There is also a tradition in later writing known as the Nero Redivivus legend. Nero, who will return, the idea that Nero was not really dead, that he had fled to Parthia and would come back at the head of an eastern army, that his return would be a sign of the end times. This tradition fed into later Christian imagery of the Antichrist, the returning figure whose arrival signals the final battle. That legend is usually read as evidence of how thoroughly the Christian tradition had made Nero into the embodiment of evil, and it is that, but it is also evidence that Nero's death was, for a significant portion of the ancient world, not a settled matter, an ending that did not feel finished. The historical record does not give us a clean picture of what the non-senatorial, non-Christian majority of the Roman Empire thought of Nero. It gives us fragments, glimpses, the occasional detail that slips through the filter of whose perspective got preserved. The false Neros are one of those glimpses. The survival of those movements for months or years in the eastern provinces is another. Together, they suggest something that the dominant tradition does not want to accommodate, that the Nero question was not settled for everyone the way it was settled for the people who wrote the books. That somewhere in the Roman world, in the villages and ports and farming communities that did not produce senators or historians, there were people for whom the death of Nero was not the relief it was for the Senate, not the triumph it became in Christian memory, but a loss, not the loss of a great ruler, the loss of someone who had been, in their experience of him, recognizably present, someone who wanted applause from people like them, someone who freed a province because he loved the people in it and wanted them to love him back. even though the freedom only lasted until the next emperor took it away. History is kept by the people who know how to keep it. They knew how. The others did not. And so we have the Nero they built, the Nero of the Senate and the Church Fathers and the historians who needed a name for the worst. That Nero is real. That Nero matters. That Nero is the one we inherited. The other one is there too. In the details that do not fit. In the false Neros sailing through the eastern Mediterranean with their borrowed faces. In the province that was free for 1 year and then was not. In the crowd at Corinth that wept when a man with absolute power gave it away for nothing but the feeling of being loved by the people in front of him. Both Neros are real. We only remember one of them. In 1499 CE, a group of artists in Rome lowered themselves through a hole in the ground on the Oppian Hill and found themselves in rooms that no one had entered in more than 1,000 years. The rooms were not empty. They were painted, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with images so unlike anything visible above ground that the artists who found them had no category for what they were looking at. Birds and flowers and mythological scenes rendered with a lightness and freedom that the heavy, formal traditions of the surface world had nothing comparable to. Figures that seemed to float rather than stand. Colors that had survived 15 centuries of darkness in a completeness that felt almost impossible. Animals and vines and open skies painted on ceilings in a way that made the ceiling disappear. That made a person standing beneath it feel not enclosed, but released into something larger than the room itself. The artists who descended into those rooms included men who would shape the visual culture of the Renaissance. They made sketches by torchlight. They carried what they saw back up into the world above and used it. The decorative vocabulary they discovered underground found its way into the Sistine Chapel, into the Vatican loggia, into the visual language of an entire era. They called the style grotesque, from the Italian word for cave, grotta. The word has since accumulated its modern meaning of bizarre, distorted, fantastically strange. It now carries connotations of ugliness and excess. The rooms they found were the buried remains of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, the Palace Nero built on the ashes of Rome, filled in by his successors, buried under the baths of Trajan, sealed beneath the city for 1,500 years. The style that helped shape the Renaissance was the style Nero commissioned for his private rooms, preserved in the dark underground, because his successors filled those rooms with rubble rather than demolish what they could not adequately explain. 2,000 years of the word grotesque, carrying inside it the buried rooms of the Golden House. And almost nobody knew. You cannot fully erase a thing by burying it. Sometimes burying it is how it survives. This is one version of what Nero left behind. Not the version he intended, not the version he would have chosen, but the version that time decided to keep. The word tyrant, in popular usage, has a face. It has had a face for 2,000 years. When people reach for an image of absolute power, exercised without wisdom or restraint, when they want a historical shorthand for the ruler who confused his own needs with his people's needs, who mistook performance for governance, they reach for Nero. His name became the word. The thing that words do when they stop being proper nouns and start being categories. He appears in Dante's Inferno. He appears in medieval chronicles as the embodiment of vice. He appears in Shakespeare's references as shorthand for murderous cruelty. He appears in every subsequent era that needed a name for the particular combination of power and self-indulgence and the destruction that combination produces. He achieved the thing that he wanted. He is remembered. He is more durably, more widely, more deeply remembered than almost any person who lived in the 1st century CE, more remembered than most emperors whose reigns were more successful, more remembered than most rulers whose governance was more humane. He just has no control over what he is remembered for. He wanted to be remembered as the artist, the performer, the person who stood on the stage and did the thing and heard the audience respond to the doing of it. He wanted the applause to be for him, the actual him, the person underneath the emperor and underneath the dynasty and underneath all the preparation and positioning that Agrippina had built around him. What he got was the opposite of that. He is remembered not as the artist but as the arsonist, not as the performer but as the persecutor, not as the person who wept at Corinth when a crowd responded with something that felt like the real thing. He is remembered through the eyes of his enemies, written in their language, shaped by their needs, serving their purposes across 20 centuries, during which the needs changed, but the name remained. And yet the rooms survived, the grotesque survived, the false Neros sailed. The crowd at Corinth wept, the slave Epaphroditus stayed to the end. The soldier who arrived too late still knelt. Something survived that the official memory did not intend to preserve. The residue of a person who actually existed underneath the symbol, who had genuine responses to genuine things, who felt something real when the crowd at Corinth responded to him, who meant it when he said, "What an artist dies in me." The complete answer to who he was includes a boy who was never asked what he wanted, a mother who shaped him into something she needed him to be, a philosopher who tried to answer an unanswerable question, an empire that handed one person the weight of the world and then expected that person to carry it without breaking. The complete answer includes the rooms underground with the painted birds and the floating figures, surviving in the dark for 1500 years, waiting to teach the Renaissance something it did not know. It was learning from a man it thought it had buried. He wanted to be loved. Some people loved him. They just did not get to write the history. He wanted applause. He got the argument that has never stopped. A man who wanted to be remembered, still being argued about 2,000 years later, in rooms that still carry his name.